There's a man in London who hasn't looked up in 31 years. Not really. Not in the way you'd think. He looks up for the rain. He looks up when a pigeon lands too close to his boot. He looks up for the changing of the guard because that's part of the job, and the job is everything. But if you asked him, if you actually pulled him aside after his shift and asked him, how do you know? He'd answer before you finish the question. I hear them before I see them. His name is Wallace Pemberton. He will tell you this himself if you ask, which almost nobody does because tourists don't ask guards their names. They ask for photographs. They ask for directions to the gift shop. They ask, always endlessly, why the guards never smile. Wallace smiles, just not where anyone can see it. It was October when I first heard about him. Not from a newspaper, not from some polished documentary with mood lighting and a string quartet underneath. I heard about him from my cousin Harriet, who works at a tea room 3 streets from Buckingham Palace and has the kind of memory for people that most of us only apply to passwords and grudges. She told me over the phone, voice dropping like she was sharing something mildly illegal. There's a guard, she said. They call him the listener. Not officially, just among the staff. The other guards, the footmen, the people who work the gates. They say he knew the late Queen was approaching the east entrance once, from inside the building, before the car even turned the corner. He just stood up straighter. Someone asked him later, and he said he heard her walk. I laughed. She didn't. I'm serious. Her walk was different from everyone else's. He said it was measured, deliberate, like every step was considered before it landed. I stopped laughing, because that's the kind of detail you don't invent. I went to London in November. Gray, beautiful, damp November, the kind of London that smells like wet stone and diesel and something sweet from a vendor cart you can never quite locate. I had no plan beyond finding Wallace Pemberton and standing near enough to watch him work. What I did not expect was for him to notice me first. The forecourt of Buckingham Palace in November is quieter than the summer madness, but it is never empty. There were perhaps 40 tourists on the day I arrived, Americans in matching windbreakers, a Japanese school group with coordinated rain ponchos, a young couple who kept kissing against the fence railings in the specific way of people who believe that public affection is a form of protest. I was standing about 15 feet from the sentry box on the eastern side, watching Wallace. He was magnificent in the technical sense of the word. Tall, absolutely still, bearskin hat shadowing his face to the jaw. His hands were at his sides. The chin was up. The eyes, from what I could see, were unfocused in that deliberate military way, looking at everything by looking at nothing. And then his posture changed. Not dramatically. It wasn't a flinch. It wasn't a turn of the head. It was a millimeter of adjustment in the shoulders, a micro-correction like a compass needle finding north. Something behind me was pulling his attention without him moving toward it. I turned. A black car was pulling onto the mall, still some distance away. There was nothing about it visually that distinguished it from any other vehicle, no visible insignia from where I stood, no outriders, nothing. Just a car, moving at a moderate speed. Wallace had already come to a posture that I can only describe as more upright, more present, more inhabited. I watched the car approach. I watched it slow near the gate. I watched a small flag I hadn't noticed before, not a royal standard, something internal, something only people who knew would know, and I realized the car was carrying a member of the household. Wallace had known before the flag was visible. He had known before I could see the car clearly. He had known the way you know a song from its first 3 notes, before the melody arrives, because you've heard it so many times it lives in the part of your brain that doesn't bother telling the rest. I got my meeting with him 2 days later. Harriet arranged it through a contact who knew a footman who owed someone a favor, the kind of social chain that only functions in neighborhoods with centuries of layered obligation. We met at a pub on a side street. Not a tourist pub, a working pub with a dartboard that had seen actual use and a carpet that was trying to forget its own history. Wallace Pemberton was out of uniform. He looked smaller without the bearskin, which is not an insult. Every monument looks smaller when you get close to it. He was perhaps 60, built lean in the way of men who have spent decades standing rather than sitting, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of stillness that doesn't leave when the shift ends. He was nursing a half pint of something dark. He did not look up when I came in. He said, "You were at the East Sentry box on Tuesday, by the railing. You had a notebook, but you didn't open it until about 11 minutes in." I sat down. He looked up then. His eyes were the particular light blue of old ice, not cold, exactly, just ancient. "I noticed things," he said. "Occupational." I asked him about the car. "The black car on Tuesday." He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone deciding whether to answer. The quiet of someone translating something internal into words it was not designed to become. "It was the weight," he said finally. I asked him what he meant. "The way a car sits on the road. The wheel weight distribution. When there's someone significant inside. Not celebrity significant. I mean significant in the way that certain people carry themselves as though the ground owes them something. The car moves differently. It's subtle. It's in the chassis suspension. Most people don't register it because they're looking at the car. I don't look at the car." He took a sip of his drink. "What do you look at?" I asked. "The road," he said. "The road tells you everything. The car is just the announcement. The road is the conversation." He told me about his first week at the palace. He was 26. He had come from a regiment that's stationed in Edinburgh, cold, formal, precise, and London felt to him like Edinburgh with its corset loosened, which was not a compliment. He stood his first shift in late spring, sweating under the bearskin in a way that felt both undignified and medically inadvisable. His sergeant at the time was a man named Ogilvy, square as a filing cabinet, voice like someone reading terms and conditions aloud. Ogilvy had said something to him on day 3 that stayed. "You're watching the wrong thing. Everyone watches the gate. Watch the ground. The ground is honest. People lie. Faces lie. Uniforms lie. But the ground, nobody thinks to lie to the ground." Wallace had laughed. Internally, where Ogilvy couldn't dock him for it. But he looked down, and he'd kept looking. Within a year, he could identify his sergeant's approach by the particular way Ogilvy's left heel struck slightly harder than his right, a legacy of a football injury in 1987 that Ogilvy never mentioned and everyone knew about. Within 3 years, he could identify the household staff by their cadence. The housekeeper who walked like she was perpetually late and had accepted it. The aide who always paused mid-corridor, half a beat, as if reconsidering something. The footman who moved in perfect silence and somehow made that silence loud. And then, one autumn, he heard it for the first time. A walk unlike anything else. Not fast, not slow, deliberate in a way that wasn't performance. Performance has anxiety underneath it, a slight tension in the strike. This was different. This was someone who had been walking this ground for so long that the ground had simply agreed to accept them. He came to attention before he knew he was doing it. He heard, a moment later, the specific creak of a particular door, and then the soft exchange of voices, and then a presence that entered his peripheral vision with the unhurried certainty of weather. Afterward, a colleague had nudged him. "Did you hear her coming?" Wallace had said yes. The colleague had stared at him. "From where?" "She came through the inner passage. You're posted here." And Wallace had not been able to explain it. Not then. Not with the right words. He just knew that some walks carry their own announcement. That some people have learned, through birth or discipline or sheer accumulated consequence, to let each step land with complete intention. And intention, if you know what to listen for, has a sound. I asked him how many of them he'd learned. He looked at the table. His fingers moved slightly, not counting exactly, more like shuffling through something. "Enough," he said. He didn't elaborate. I didn't push. There are answers that live in the pause after them, and this was one. What he did say, after another sip, after a moment of looking at something past my shoulder that wasn't there, was this: "The hardest ones to learn are the new ones. The young ones. They haven't settled into themselves yet. Their walk is still an argument. Still becoming something. The older ones, they've made peace with how they move. There's no negotiation in it anymore. You learn those fast. The young ones take years." "Why?" He looked at me directly. "Because the young ones are still deciding who they are. And a walk that's still deciding, it sounds different every time." Outside, November pressed against the pub windows. Wet and indifferent. A bus ground past. Somewhere a delivery door banged open and then shut. Wallace Pemberton finished his half-pint and set the glass down with a precision that was probably completely unconscious. I thought about what he'd said for a long time after, still deciding who they are. I thought about how you could spend 31 years listening to the ground, to the way weight distributes, to the way intention settles into a heel strike, to the way some people walk as though the earth is a formality and others walk as though they're asking its permission, and what that does to a person, what it costs, what it gives. I thought about how Wallace Pemberton has spent 3 decades at the most visible post in the country without looking at the faces, and how in doing so he may have understood those faces more deeply than anyone who looked directly into them. The pub noise rose and fell around us. I did not open my notebook. Some things you don't write down while they're still happening. There is a sound that only Buckingham Palace makes at 4 in the morning. It is not silence. Silence is an absence, and the palace at 4 in the morning is not absent anything. It is simply breathing on a frequency that the daytime crowd drowns out. The gravel settles. The old stone contracts in the cold. Somewhere, in some corridor built for people whose names are on currency, a door closes with the soft authority of a mechanism that was fitted to last beyond whoever commissioned it. Wallace Pemberton knew this sound the way most people know their own heartbeat, not by listening for it, by noticing when it changed. He told me about the night of the incident on our second meeting, which was not planned. He rang Harriet's tea room. She gave him a number herself, apparently, which she later denied, and then admitted, and left a message asking if I was still in London. I was. We met at the same pub, same table, different half-pint. He looked like he'd slept poorly, or perhaps just thought heavily, which in his case appeared to produce the same physical result. He said, "I want to tell you something that I haven't told anyone who would write it down. But I think you should know it because you asked the right question last time." I asked what the right question was. "You asked what it costs," he said. I hadn't asked that, technically, but I'd thought it. And apparently with Wallace Pemberton, the gap between thinking a question and asking it was narrow enough to cross. It was 2009, February, a year that, he said, felt like it had been designed by someone with a grudge. He was on a night rotation, unusual, but not unheard of for certain periods. The palace in February is a different creature than the palace in July. No tourists, no photographers pressed against the gates. Just the cold, the gravel, the distant sound of London existing at a remove. He liked those shifts. He'd never admitted this to anyone because liking something about your post implies you have opinions about it, and opinions are the kind of luxury you shed with your civilian clothes. But he liked them. At approximately 2:47 in the morning, he heard footsteps. This is not unusual at the palace. The palace is a working residence with a staff complement that doesn't sleep in full and a security rotation that maintains presence at all hours. Footsteps are the palace's native language. He'd learned to read them the way a doctor learns to read an ECG. Most rhythms are normal, variations within range, nothing to interrupt your breathing for. These footsteps were wrong, not in a criminal way, not in the way that triggers training. He knew that response, and it was not this. Wrong in a smaller, stranger way. The cadence was correct, measured, even authorized. The steps belonged to someone who knew where they were going and had the right to go there. But there was something underneath the cadence. A weight distribution he hadn't heard before. Not the weight of physical mass, the weight of something carried. Invisible luggage. The kind that bows a person slightly inward without changing their silhouette. He'd heard grief before in footsteps. He'd learned it slowly, in the way you learn anything about pain, by first learning it wrong, and then having the wrongness corrected by reality. He knew grief's rhythm. It rushes and then stops. It argues with itself. It takes extra fractions of a second in certain places, as though the feet have forgotten the instruction from the brain and need to be reminded. This was different. This was grief that had been trained, practiced, walked into submission. The kind you develop when public collapse is not available to you as an option, when the corridor between the private self and the performing self has been permanently narrowed by decades of being observed. He came to attention, not the parade ground attention of the daytime post. Something quieter, something that was less about the body and more about the self, a straightening that happened inside the uniform first. The footsteps paused. He was in a shadow. He knew this. Whoever was walking had almost certainly not seen him. The pause lasted perhaps 4 seconds, and then the footsteps moved again, steadier, marginally, as though the pause had been a calibration, a private moment of collecting something that had scattered, and now they were walking again, put back together, every step accounted for. He did not move. He did not speak. He breathed at roughly the rate of the gravel settling, and he listened to those footsteps carry their invisible weight down the corridor until they turned and were gone. He looked at his glass for a moment. I did not say anything. There are stories that need the silence after them to finish arriving. I don't know who it was, he said. I never looked up. I couldn't see them clearly from where I stood, and I didn't try. It felt wrong to try. He paused, but I knew what I heard, and I knew, this is the part I've never said out loud, I knew it wasn't grief about something ordinary. It was the kind of grief that doesn't have a single occasion. It's what grief becomes when it's been lived with long enough that it's just part of the architecture, part of how the person walks. He looked up. I think some people become so accustomed to loss that it stops being an event. It becomes a posture, and I heard that posture walking past me at 2:47 in the morning in February in a palace that was mostly asleep, and I just stood there and did nothing, he said, not as self-criticism, as fact. What could you have done? I asked. He thought about this for a long moment. I could have made a sound, he said. Something small. Not words. Not an intrusion. Just a sound that said, I hear you. Someone hears you. He picked up his glass. Put it down without drinking. I didn't, because it's not my place. Because the job is presence without participation. You stand witness. You don't join. Do you regret it? The blue eyes came back to mine. Every February, he said. Just February. I want to tell you about something that happened while Wallace was talking, because it matters, and I only understood it later. There was a woman at the bar. 50-something. Red coat. She'd been there when we arrived, and she was still there, working through a glass of wine with the particular focused attention of someone who is not drinking to drink, but drinking to think. I'd barely registered her. At some point while Wallace was talking, I think around the 2:47 detail, she turned slightly on her stool. Not toward us. Away. She looked at the dartboard. Unfocused. The way you look at something when what you're actually doing is listening. She had a slight tilt to her left shoulder. I noticed it the way you notice something without knowing why you're noticing it. An old injury, maybe, or the permanent residue of decades of carrying something on one side. A bag, a child, a habit of the body shaped by the habits of the life. She finished her wine and left without looking at us. I thought, Wallace would have known her by her footsteps before she sat down. I thought, the world is full of people walking through it with a whole record of their lives encoded in their gait, and almost none of us have the patience or the silence to listen. He told me about the day he realized his own footsteps had changed. It was 5 years into his posting. He was visiting his mother in Shropshire. Good woman, worrier by vocation, had never quite believed that standing in front of a palace constituted employment. He walked into her kitchen, and she looked at him in a way that was not his mother's ordinary look. You walk differently, she said. He asked her what she meant. She pointed at his feet, a gesture so specifically mother-like that he had to look away to stop from smiling, and said, You used to stomp. You were always a stomper. Every house knew when you were coming. Now you, she paused, searching for it, arrive. He thought about that for 30 years. Arrive, as though the previous version of him had been traveling constantly, always in motion toward something, never quite landing. And the job had not slowed him down exactly, but taught him to put the full weight of himself into each step, to commit to where he was before moving to where he was going. The job does that, he said, if you let it. Some men do 20 years of sentry, and they just clock out. They're never really there. They endure. I understand that. The stillness is brutal if you're fighting it. But if you stop fighting, Then it teaches you things, he said, things that are worth knowing. About attention, about how much of the world is audible if you're willing to just stand in it. Not move, not react, just stand and listen. He turned his glass on the coaster. Quarter turn. Precise. Most people never stand anywhere long enough to hear what that place is saying. On the way back to Harriet's, I stopped on a bridge over the Thames. Not a famous bridge. One of the minor ones, used mainly by people who actually need to get somewhere rather than people who want to photograph a crossing. I stood there for maybe 15 minutes. I didn't do anything. I just stood. I tried to listen the way Wallace had described, not to specific sounds, but to the space under the sounds. The way the bridge felt slightly different under buses than under cars. The way the water below was moving in one register, and the wind was moving in another, and somehow both of them were having conversation that I was standing in the middle of without having been invited. I thought about footsteps, about how much of ourselves we broadcast with every step, our history, our state of mind, our relationship with the ground beneath us, about how most of us stride through our lives assuming we're opaque, private, unknowable, and about how there is at least one man in London standing at the Eastern Sentry box who would hear us coming before we arrived, who would know something true about us before we ever open our mouths, who has spent 31 years learning to read the only part of ourselves that doesn't bother to lie. The Thames moved below me, dark and very old. I walked back to Harriet's, and I paid attention to how my feet hit the pavement on my last morning in London. A child tried to make Wallace Pemberton laugh. She was perhaps 7. Red wellies. The kind of determined expression that 7-year-olds deploy when they have decided that a thing is possible and adult skepticism is simply an obstacle to be processed. She stood in front of the sentry box for a full 4 minutes, pulling faces, escalating in absurdity, starting with crossed eyes and working up through a sequence that I believe culminated in her impression of a fish confronting an existential crisis. Wallace did not laugh. He did not laugh in the rigid, performative way of someone suppressing it. He was simply elsewhere, present in the body, present in the post, but attending to something the rest of us couldn't access. The child's father eventually steered her away, half embarrassed, half delighted. Wallace's left shoulder moved, just slightly, just once. It was the smallest possible thing, and I was probably the only person in the forecourt who caught it. He had asked to meet one more time. I'd assumed this was the conclusion, the last conversation, the thing he hadn't said yet that he decided to say. People who hold things for a long time tend to release them in stages, not all at once. Wallace had given me October, then November. Now we were in the last days of the month, and he had something more. This time he chose a different location. Not the pub. A park bench on Birdcage Walk, directly adjacent to St. James's Park, which in late November is a stripped-down version of itself. All bare branches and pewter light, the kind of landscape that looks like the world is taking stock of itself before winter sets the final terms. He was already there when I arrived. He was watching the path. Not the trees. Not the lake. The path. The pedestrian path along the walk, along which a stream of Londoners and tourists and civil servants moved in the particular directional current of people who need to be somewhere adjacent to where they are. "Do you know why I like this bench?" he asked without looking up. I said I didn't. "You can hear the footpath from here," he said. Different surfaces, gravel, then pavement, then that stretch of packed dirt by the lake. People change when the surface changes. You can hear them decide. I sat down next to him. We watched the path for a while. "Hear that?" he said at some point. I listened. There was a runner approaching from the left. I could hear the rhythmic impact before I could see him. Even cadence, mid-foot strike, the specific pace of someone running a comfortable distance rather than fleeing something. "Runner," I said. "Runner," Wallace agreed. "But he's going to stop before the bend." "How do you know?" "He's slowing down. Micro-deceleration. 3 footfalls ago." The runner slowed. Stopped at a bench 20 meters ahead. Bent over with hands on knees. I stared. "He's done this run before," Wallace said. "That's where he always stops. The body has its agreements with the route. You can hear the negotiation ahead of the decision." He told me about the one time he'd been wrong. This was clearly the thing he'd been building toward. He'd offered October and November as context, as the architecture that made this moment comprehensible. And now here it was on a park bench in the cold, in a voice that was barely louder than the gravel. It was 6 years ago. There had been a period of significant transition within the household. One of those restructured moments where old roles shift and new presences establish themselves, when the palace's internal ecosystem recalibrates like a weather system finding a new pattern. These periods are, Wallace said, the hardest to navigate auditorily. Everything is new. The footsteps are unlearned. You're starting from nothing with everyone. He began building his new library of sounds. There was one that confused him. A walk that arrived on the eastern approach every Thursday at approximately 10:15. Regular, deliberate, correct in every technical sense. Authorized, appropriate, but carrying something he couldn't name. Not grief, as he'd learned grief. Not anxiety, which has a particular half-stutter he'd come to recognize. Not the performative confidence of someone pretending to authority they haven't yet earned. Something else. Something he'd never heard before. He filed it, kept listening, built up a catalog across 3 months of Thursdays. By January, he had a tentative conclusion. This was the walk of someone navigating an enormous, unfamiliar weight. Not with resentment, not with reluctance, but with the specific careful attention of someone who has accepted a thing before fully understanding it. Like watching someone carry a glass object in both hands down a corridor they haven't fully mapped. Complete, concentrated care. Every step in negotiation with consequence. He decided this was a young member of staff, newly elevated. He was wrong. He discovered this, the wrongness of it, by accident, through a fragment of conversation he was not meant to hear between two footmen near the ambassador's entrance. He heard a name. He put together. He stood in the gravel for a long moment after. Not because he'd made an error in the technical sense. Not because his method had failed. But because what he'd identified, the careful attention, the deliberate navigation of enormous unfamiliar weight, was not a member of staff at all. And the reason the walk was new, the reason it didn't fit any category he'd built, was because the person walking was not performing a role they'd been trained for since birth. They were learning it in real time. Every Thursday, on the Eastern approach, at 10:15, carrying it carefully, both hands, down a corridor they hadn't quite mapped. He was quiet for a while. The park did its November thing. Pigeons negotiated a dropped pastry nearby with the humorless efficiency of a planning committee. I call it a mistake, Wallace said, but I don't know if it was. I identified the weight correctly. I identified the care. I had the emotional truth of the walk right. I just assigned it to the wrong person. Does that happen often? With people I don't know? Yes. That's normal. You build the catalog with time. He turned his head slightly. Not toward me, toward the path. What bothered me, he said, was that I hadn't expected to hear that particular quality of learning in that particular walk. We build assumptions about people before we've actually listened to them. I'd built assumptions, and the assumptions were loud enough that they almost drowned out what was actually there. What was actually there? He looked at the path. Someone doing their honest best with something very heavy, he said. That's all. That's what I heard under everything else. Under the authority and the correctness and the presentation star. Just someone doing their best. Asterisk, he said plainly. No detorializing. No sentimental softening. Just that. I thought about this later, about how 31 years of listening to the ground had produced, in Wallace Pemberton, something that perhaps no amount of looking produces in most of us. Not insight exactly. Not wisdom in the fortune cookie sense. Something more specific than that. The ability to encounter a person at their most unguarded, at the level of their stride, their weight distribution, the micro decisions they make with their bodies before their faces have time to arrange themselves, and to simply register what is there, without projection, without the noise of assumption, with only the patient, accumulated knowledge of what different kinds of weights sound like, landing on honest ground. He'd been wrong about the identity. He'd been exactly right about the person. The last thing he told me, and he said it standing because we both stood to go, and he said it looking at the path rather than at me, which I think was the only way he could say it all, was this: people ask me why I chose this posting. 31 years is a long time to stand in front of the same building. They expect a patriotic answer or a proud one. He watched a woman in a green coat cross the path, her footsteps distinct against the packed dirt. The honest answer is, I chose it because I understood early that the most important things don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with flags and motorcades. They arrive quietly in the spaces between the official events, in the corridors at 2:47 in the morning, in the sound of someone carrying something they haven't been given a manual for. And I wanted to be somewhere those things could reach me. He adjusted his collar, a small, precise gesture. Faces are performances, even unconscious ones. The face is always already composing itself. But the ground is where the performance hasn't got to yet. The ground is where the person lives before the person decides who they are in public. He looked at me then. That's what I've been listening to for 31 years. Not royals, not protocols, not the ceremony. He paused. The part of them that doesn't know it's being heard. I flew back from Heathrow the following morning. The airport, as airports are, was a spectacular education in footsteps. Thousands of people moving with 100 different relationships to urgency, to anxiety, to anticipation and dread, and the specific gray exhaustion of transit. I sat at my gate, and I did something I hadn't done in years. I listened, not to conversations, not to announcements, to the floor, to the way some people struck it hard, chasing something, the way others barely touched it, as though the ground were a courtesy rather than a foundation, to the particular unmistakable sound of a child running for no reason, that full weight, arms out, consequence-free percussion that grown adults lose somewhere between 8 and 45 and spend the rest of their lives not quite recovering. I didn't look up for most of it, and in not looking up, I saw something I couldn't have seen by looking. I saw all of us, exactly as we are, before we know we're being seen. The weight of us, the hesitation, the history packed into the heel strike, the intention loaded into the toe, all of it audible, all of it honest, all of it broadcasting itself into a world that almost never has the patience to receive it. Wallace Pemberton has spent 31 years receiving it, at the most watched address on earth, standing in front of the most photographed gate in the world, looking at the ground. I think about him on ordinary days now, days when I'm walking somewhere, to a meeting, to a shop, through a park, and my feet hit the pavement with whatever I happen to be carrying that day. The good days when there's a kind of lightness in the stride, the mornings when everything feels negotiable, the evenings when the weight of some particular thing settles into my gait in ways I can't control. I think, somewhere in London, a man would hear all of this, and in hearing it would understand something true about who I am today, in this moment, before I've composed a single sentence about myself. There's something clarifying about that, something that makes the performing feel less necessary. We are most honest in our footsteps. Long after the face has arranged its mask, long after the voice has selected its register, long after we've decided who we are today for public purposes, the ground still knows. The ground keeps the record, and Wallace Pemberton reads it every day in front of a palace that has stood for 3 centuries, built on the same earth we all walk on. The ground is honest. People lie. Faces lie. Uniforms lie. But the ground, nobody thinks to lie to the ground. Sergeant Ogilvy, 1997. Passed on to Wallace Pemberton. Passed on now to you.